Hey everyone, so I come to you for another Maybe Midrash review, and Maybe Midrash is an event that I've talked about several times, but I will leave links to the announcement videos for it in the description if you want to learn more about it. But this is my second Maybe Midrash review. I've already done one about Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather, and my second one is going to be of God, a Biography by Jack Miles. Now, this was published in 1995 and actually won the Pulitzer Prize, as you can see on that gigantic sticker, for biography or autobiography, which is interesting to me that it won in that category, because I feel like it's actually more of a work of literary criticism. And it's a very simple book with a very simple premise, but on the other hand, it is very subtle and thought-provoking and complex, and I see myself returning to it, or at least returning to parts of it many times in the future. So what the premise of this book is Jack Miles approaches the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, not the Christian Old Testament, which is ordered slightly differently. He approaches the Hebrew Bible as though it were a biography of a character named God. That's all. That's how he approaches it. And he just reads the Hebrew Bible in that way and deals with all of the difficulties and insights and complexities that raises. Really, I think that this is an essential work for anyone who's interested in the Bible, either as a work of literature or as a religious text. I believe Jack Miles is himself a former Jesuit, and I think he may still be a believing Christian, so, this is a book that is written to be friendly to believers. And that's an incredibly simple premise, but the bounty of insights that it provides to the Bible is just staggering. What we see in the Bible when we look at it this way is basically a process of God discovering himself. Miles makes the point very early on in the book that God is a very weird character because he really only exists in relation to people, to his creation. We never actually see God just sitting and thinking on his own, basically. We never see him just sort of go for a walk and or sit down and think by himself, except in the opening chapters of Genesis. But those are very brief, and he creates human beings literally on the seventh or on the sixth day, so he's not alone for very long. But the weird aspect of the character of God that raises is the fact that he's not exactly he doesn't exactly have an independent consciousness. All of his actions and words are spoken and performed in relation to humankind. And basically what we see in this book is that through his often ambivalent feelings about and actions towards his creation, towards humanity, he basically discovers himself. We see God change very subtly over the course of the Hebrew Bible, and through that, he becomes the God that most people know, most, believing Christians or Jews know. And there's one passage that sort of summarizes this very well. Perhaps because God has no life other than the one he lives through mankind, because, in other words, there is no purely divine experience from which he might benefit, nearly all his key experiences seem to subvert his intentions. After each of his major actions, he discovers that he has not done quite what he thought he was doing, or has done something he never intended to do. He did not realize when he told mankind to be fertile and increase that he was creating an image of himself that was also a rival creator. He did not realize when he destroyed his rival that he would regret the destruction of his image. That's a reference to the flood. He did not realize that his covenant with Abraham, the reconciliation of such contrary urges within his own character, would require him, precisely because he had so effectively made Abraham into a great nation, to go to war with Egypt. He did not realize, when he went to war with Egypt, that his victory would leave him with an entire people on his hands and would require him to become a lawgiver for them and conquer a land for them to live in. He did not realize that when he gave them the law that where there is law there can be transgression, and that therefore he himself had turned an implicitly unbreakable covenant into an explicitly breakable one. He did not realize when he began to withdraw from his alliance with Israel after Israel's first minor infidelities that the aftermath would be the rise of a king, David, whose charisma would draw the Lord, almost despite himself, into a quasi-parental relationship with his semi-abandoned ally. He did not realize when his erstwhile ally deserted him wholesale and he made Assyria and Babylonia the tools of his vengeance that he was creating a new international role for himself. He did not realize that once they had inflicted his punishment for him, his feelings, rather than only those of a vindicated suzerain, would also be those of a grieving husband for a battered wife. He did not realize, as he contemplated her suffering, that he would find a meaning in human suffering unlike any he had ever seen before. And, and that just speaks to the sort of problem that a monotheistic God raises, because, one of the themes that Jack Moss touches on is the fact that the God of the Hebrew Bible was revolutionary in the sense that there was only one of them, right? In the ancient world, most religions were polytheistic. And so the ancient Israelites were taking many disparate myths that were at large in Mesopotamia and Canaan at the time, and sort of melding them together and forcing a lot of different personalities to fit into one entity. So you had Marduk, who was the creator god. You had Tiamat, who is the destroyer god, who in Mesopotamian myths brought about the flood. You have the personal god of Mesopotamia, which is a sort of individualized god that only serves one particular family, and God acts as that for the family of Abraham. And you have Baal, who's the war god, basically, and a fertility god. God, as he's conceived of in the Hebrew Bible, has to somehow contain all of these disparate personalities within himself. He has to be a war god, he has to be a creator god, he has to be a fertility god, he has to be a personal god, and he has to contain all those within himself and still somehow be a coherent personality. And that's what makes him such a fascinating character. And on the one hand, that raises a lot of difficulties, but on the other hand, it does kind of bring into sharp clarity a lot of the more weird or paradoxical events that take place in the Old Testament that seem kind of out of place and inexplicable. That brings me to my next point, which is that this is a biography of God, obviously, but in addition to that, it is a discussion of a literary character, and God, the character, is in many ways a precursor to how characters would be portrayed in the modern world, as perhaps exemplified by my best friend Shakespeare. And sort of what I mean by that is that, when you look at ancient classics of Greece and Rome, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, the characters there don't tend to be fully fleshed out human beings with complex personalities who have a character arc. Much as I love the Iliad or the Metamorphoses or Oedipus Rex, the characters don't have the same kind of change that they undergo in something like Shakespeare, and they don't overhear themselves, as Harold Bloom would put it. Harold Bloom has argued that one of the most important aspects of Shakespearean character is that the characters overhear themselves, and by doing that, they are changed. And you might also say that they see themselves as well. They see their own actions and change by seeing their own actions. Characters in the ancient world don't tend to do that. Oedipus doesn't do that. Achilles doesn't do that. But God does, as I think is exemplified by the passage I've already read. And in that sense, God really is also important literarily, in just the sense that he was a precursor to how we would see character today. And there's one passage that sort of exemplifies that. The Tanakh is different from both being Hamlet and Oedipus. It is far nearer in spirit to Hamlet than to Oedipus Rex. Its action originates within the character of its protagonist, and even when he fails to act, his failure lingers as a more important reality than any event or chain of events. No inexorably functioning fate, proceeding autonomously without him, ever succeeds him as the engine of the Tanakh's forward motion. The total absence from the conclusion of the Tanakh of any impersonal alternatives to the personal God is undeniable. The action right down to the last page of the collection begins either with God or with human beings. There is no third alternative. No fate, no nature, no cosmos, no ground of all being. And, I think that, that's just fascinating. The idea that God is like the precursor of the way we think of characters in the modern world. And in addition to that, in addition to all of that, this also just has some brilliant, innovative readings of certain books of the Bible that will make me certainly never look at them quite in the same way. So the one book where I felt this the most was in the Book of Job. Jack Miles sort of looks at the traditional interpretation of the Book of Job, which is that Job, complains to God about how bleak human existence is and rebukes God for creating such an awful world in the wake of him basically losing everything. And what we see after that is God, in turn, rebuking Job, in which he basically gives him a non-answer to his challenge, which is just to say, well, I'm God, I'm Almighty God, who are you to question me? And the usual narrative around the end of Job is that Job, after that, feels repentant, feels contrite and asks for God's forgiveness, and God does forgive him, and that's why Job has his wealth and his happiness sort of restored to him at the end. Jack Miles takes issue with that, and he does some really subtle readings of some of the ambiguities in the Hebrew in the Book of Job that suggest that, in fact, Job's challenge to God is far more damning than the traditional interpretation would lead you to believe. Basically, the conclusion that Jack Miles comes to is that when God restores Job's wealth and happiness at the end of the Book of Job, it's not to reward Job for, being contrite and realizing that, he was in the wrong for rebuking God, but in fact it's actually to make it up to Job, because he feels bad for Job after doing what he did to him, and feels bad for the world that he created in a certain sense. And so the Book of Job is a far more, is a challenge that's a lot harder to overcome in that sense. And I can't go into the details of that argument, but that's just one example of an argument in this book that I just, it was just fascinating. Again, I can't recommend this highly enough as a reading experience. It's beautifully written, and just incredibly insightful. So anyway, if you read this book, give me your thoughts. If you have any thoughts, if you've read the Bible or anything else, then just let me know, because this is just a great book. One of the best nonfiction books I've read this year. So, yeah. Anyway, that is God, a biography. I'm hoping to do one more, maybe Midrash review about A History of God by Karen Armstrong. We will see if I can manage it. It's going to be a hard book to review, but I will try. So, anyway, thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a good day. Bye, guys.